Most of the private well owners are in my district. This area was brought into the district in 2015 after we had a bill passed at the state legislature to bring this in order to protect the Trinity aquifer from a pumping operation that was trying to come in to provide water to actually the incorporated townships east of the freeway. So by bringing it in, we were able to monitor the wells at the level they intended to pump and determine that there was, we could measure the drawdown, and at that, we were able to negotiate a permit for them, basically, that said you can only take this much, not as much as you wanted. We ended up never issuing a permit. They contested it, and then they withdrew their permit application. So it never went anywhere, but we stopped them, and then Kinder Morgan came and put their oil pipeline right over their wells, so that pretty much killed that project. So we're here today to talk about drought, and what we have here is kind of a unique opportunity. First, I want to thank the staff from the district for coming out on a Saturday morning. This is not something we've often done, but we have a great deal of expertise and knowledge, and we're going to talk through kind of generally an overview of the district, an overview of the geology, how aquifers are managed, some discussion on what we call desired future conditions, which is what we target in terms of how low can the aquifer be drawn down. And we look at that every 5 years, and we're just kind of starting that process for this next 5-year period. So it's a good opportunity for everybody to kind of talk through and understand how the aquifer works. I will say this part of the Trinity is still being studied. We understand the Edwards aquifer very well, how the water moves through it. That feeds Barton Springs. So originally, the district was focused on the Barton Springs portion of the Edwards aquifer and protecting that. And then they extended down here to cover the Trinity aquifer, which lies under the Edwards in this portion of the area. And that was kind of a unique interpretation that allowed this whole management area to be brought under management. Is understanding that Edwards aquifer, which controls the water going into San Antonio, in this area is very thin. And since the water drilling operation was going through the Edwards into the Trinity, Edwards said, well, we can't manage it. It's not under our regulatory capabilities. So the Barton Springs took a different approach, says, no, we manage everything, all aquifers, under the geographic boundaries of our district. Brief history. Anyway, we have Tim Loftus, the general manager, who's going to kind of talk through, give you an overview of the district and what we do. And then we have hydrogeologists, and we have our regulatory person here, Aaron. And I'm going to have them all introduce themselves as they come up, or Tim can introduce them. And I'm going to step aside.
Hello. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming out this morning. I'm Tim Loftus, General Manager of the district, and let me go ahead and introduce staff here, beginning with David Marino, our Communications and Outreach Manager. And we have Justin Camp, our Hydro Technician and local drought expert as well. And then we have Aaron Swanson, who's our Regulatory Compliance Manager, and Jeff Watson, one of our two hydrogeologists on staff. So between the 5 of us, that's half the staff here from the district, and it's a beautiful morning to be here. So as Dan mentioned, the district was born in 1987, and each groundwater conservation district in Texas is born of its own unique enabling legislation, and there are 98 of them, plus the Edwards Aquifer Authority and a couple of subsidence districts in the Houston region. And so that's where we get our marching orders, if you will, and we have a pretty specific mandate. As Dan mentioned, the district grew in 2015 when this area was annexed into the Barton Springs District, and our purview here is strictly with the Trinity Aquifer. So the Edwards Aquifer Authority, that's why we call it the shared territory, because the Edwards Aquifer Authority still manages Edwards wells in this part of the county. So in addition to the 10 staff members, we have a board of directors of 5 people, and Director Pickens, of course, is one of those. So I'll just make a few more comments. As you know, surface water in the state belongs to the state of Texas. If you want an allocation of surface water, you have to apply for a permit and a set allocation. Groundwater, on the other hand, as I'm sure you also know, is private property. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there, particularly in the hill country, when oftentimes it's hard to differentiate surface water from groundwater. They're very intimately connected here in this part of the state. And of course, they're connected, you know, in many places in various ways, but very obviously here in the hill country. The legislature nonetheless decided that groundwater conservation districts are the preferred means to manage groundwater here in the state of Texas, and so we do our level best to do that without overstepping our bounds or our boundaries. So really then our primary purpose is to balance, you know, the use of this private property versus ensuring that use is sustainable and not wasteful. And so it's a concept that sounds easy and is easy to grasp, but it's much more challenging to operationalize. So we also play a pretty important role when it comes to drought, and you're going to hear a little bit more about drought as the morning goes on here. But one of the interesting things about our role is that we can curtail pumping, regardless of what kind of permit you have, and the district issues 7 different permits. Curtailment kicks in as drought advances, you know, to one stage or another. In fact, some of our permits are 100% curtailable. Let's see. We manage through a system of permits. I mentioned we issue 5 or 7 different permits, and that's where Erin and her team comes in. Regulatory compliance. Those permits are established with a set amount of water, and then of course when drought kicks in, as I mentioned, people have to curtail by a certain amount, and then we pay attention. You know, we ensure that they're following the rules for the better of the larger groundwater community. We don't regulate exempt wells, and that would be private wells. And so if you have a private well, and I know all you folks do, by all means register it with the district so that we know about it and we can keep you informed of anything that might be relevant to the health of your well. So every permit application we receive, we evaluate it, you know, according to a set of what we call unreasonable impacts. We want to make sure that a new application isn't going to result in unreasonable impacts to existing wells. But it's important for everybody to know that we have an obligation to allow continued use of groundwater to a certain extent. All right, so there's that balancing act of allowing beneficial use, but just trying to ensure that it's not causing unreasonable impacts. All right, so our board typically meets once a month at the district office, and I'll invite you. They're public meetings, usually on the second Thursday of every month, starting at 5 p.m. You're welcome to come along and join us. The agenda is always made available early online, so if there's a topic on there that's of interest to you, by all means come on down and join us. I'll invite Jeff up to talk about the aquifers, or specifically, I suppose, the Trinity here.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jeff Watson. I'm the hydrogeologist, or one of 2 hydrogeologists at Barton Springs District, and Justin also works very closely with us in the aquifer science team. Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about the Trinity aquifer, because an aquifer can kind of be an ambiguously defined term sometimes. So as Dan mentioned, and here's another really good figure over here. So high level, when we're talking about where these aquifers occur from a map perspective, here's our district boundaries here. So you've got Hayes County, you've got Travis County up here to the northeast. These blues are the Edwards aquifer. So you've got the lighter blue where the Edwards is outcropping on the surface, and then the darker blue where the Edwards has been more deeply buried. That's one of the aquifers that we manage. And as Tim mentioned, we also manage the Trinity aquifer, which is the aquifer that we'll be talking about today. Now, the Trinity aquifer on the surface, it outcrops here, and then also to the west within the Wimberley area and Dripping Springs area. All of the units that you see on the surface when you're driving in sort of western Hayes County is the Trinity aquifer. The Trinity aquifer is, and thanks, Dan. I think that's, sorry?
Could you real quickly on that map point out where we are?
We're kind of in this little box here, right? So we're kind of on the margin of where the Edwards is on the surface and where the Trinity is on the surface.
Where is the Trinity?
The Trinity are these greens, these kind of lighter greens and darker greens.
Okay.
So you see that the darker green is actually lower units in the Trinity. As Tim mentioned before, it's often when the groundwater and surface water are interacting, it's often quite difficult to differentiate them from a legal standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, even though that's the way the state approaches it. So that's always a big challenge for us. But
Can you give me an example of where the groundwater and surface water interact?
yeah,
What
so
does that look like?
yeah, so broadly speaking, if you think of Jacob's Well Spring, that's a classic example, right? That's an artesian spring that's discharging directly out of what we call the Middle Trinity aquifer, which is, that's kind of the next step. I'll go into the different stratigraphy of the aquifer, but that's water that's leaving the aquifer and becoming surface water.
Any springs that would come up?
Sure, yeah, that's a great example.
Any of that?
Or the opposite direction, if you go further upstream in the Blanco River, oftentimes you have flow, and the flow gets completely lost, especially this time of year, and that's recharged directly into the aquifer. So often it's a very complex system, so as you go upstream and downstream, you have springs adding flow, and then that flow sometimes goes back into the subsurface. The flow from the Blanco that does make it past the Wimberley area, it actually, this is the Blanco River, it ends up flowing over the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. So that's an example of where we might say the Trinity Aquifer is actually interacting with the Edwards Aquifer indirectly through this surface water flow. So it's often a very complicated situation to untangle when we're talking about these groundwater, surface water interactions. But I think a key takeaway for today and for this particular area when we're talking about the folks here and the wells here is that almost all of the recharge from our portion of the Trinity is going to be coming from the west, from the Blanco Basin in the west, and those areas that we're talking about when we talk about groundwater and surface water interaction. Because as you go to the east, we have a structure called the Balcones Fault Zone, which probably many of you have heard about. If you ever drive through Austin and you see you're entering the environmentally sensitive Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, that's approximately the same thing as the Balcones Fault Zone. And essentially, it's a series of structures that break up the aquifer units and drop them, so that as you go further east, the aquifer units are more deeply buried. So where we're standing now, these green units that you see that are on the surface, they've actually been deeply buried. So to get a well drilled here, you usually have to go deeper than it. Like if you go to Wimberley, for example, you might only have to drill 200, 300 feet to get a productive well, whereas here you often are having to go 700, 800, 900 feet. And another key characteristic of this area is that because we're kind of far away from those groundwater surface water interactions, the aquifer doesn't respond as quickly to rainfall. It's a more muted response, right? And often the aquifer here is more responsive to pumping. So when you pump here, the water level tends to go down more then further to the west, where you have those groundwater surface water interactions. So that's a key takeaway when we're talking about managing these groundwater resources. So I wanted to jump a little bit into the stratigraphy, and we have, for all of you that have folders, we have a copy of this, so y'all can take a look at this stratigraphic column. So we've got here, as mentioned before, the Edwards is on top. There's no Edwards here. The Edwards has been fully eroded away. So you're standing where Edwards used to be millions of years ago, but it's all gone now. And then the Trinity aquifer, which is, it's actually subdivided into 3 different aquifers. It's generally about 1,000 feet thick. You've got the Upper Trinity aquifer, and we're actually standing on the Upper Trinity aquifer units right now. It's called the Upper Glen Rose is the unit. The Middle Trinity aquifer, which is composed of the Lower Glen Rose, the Hensel, which sometimes acts as a confining unit, and then the Cow Creek. And the Middle Trinity aquifer is generally the most productive aquifer within the Trinity, especially the Cow Creek. And then the Lower Trinity aquifer, which is the aquifer probably that we know least about. But there is water there, and there are some wells there. Not as many in this area, but in many other places, and in western Hays County, there are Lower Trinity aquifer wells. So the majority of domestic wells in this area are the either in the middle, well, most of them are in the Middle Trinity, and then there are some Upper Trinity wells. So Les Carnes is here today, and he actually owns one of our monitoring wells, which is an Upper Trinity monitoring well. And a key takeaway with this is that depending on which aquifer you're completed in, you may be more susceptible to impacts from the drought. So if you're in one of the shallower aquifers, you have less of a water level drop needs to occur for that water level to get close to your pump, right? Whereas if you're in the deeper well, if you've gone all the way to the Cow Creek and you've got like an 800 or 900 foot well, you might have a little bit more wiggle room there. And in your package, you'll see, can I see that hydrograph there? We've actually got this really great figure. The header is Trinity Well Hydrographs. These are water levels over time. You can see up to present day. And we actually have water levels from each of the different aquifers here, so you can see how they compare. So the red is the upper Trinity aquifer, so that's what we're talking about here. There's the Upper Glen Rose. The green is the Lower Glen Rose, so deeper than the Upper Trinity, but shallower than the Cow Creek. And then the blue is the Cow Creek. So you can see that there's actually some differences between the response. But they're all going down is really what the short of it is. And that's typical. So typically, even though we are separated from those groundwater surface water interactions, if you look over the history of the aquifer, whenever there's a lot of rain, water levels tend to go up. And whenever there's a long-term drought, water levels tend to go down. So you can see that in the other hydrograph figure there. It's just got a single graph. Our Borheim Middle Trinity well, this has a longer period of record, and it goes back to, I think, 2002 instead of 2015. So you can see that's kind of the history of the aquifer over time as we've gone into these different drought conditions. And you've got, 2009 drought, you've got the 2011 drought, and you can see here that in the historical context, we're actually close to matching where we were in 2011, which was quite a bad year in terms of drought.
Well, shall we talk drought?
Yeah.
Let's talk
Yeah,
drought.
they give me the easy job, right? Go outside. But jokes aside, I'm not going to tell you guys anything you don't already know. We're aware of drought. We're in it, and it's getting worse. But today, taking advantage of being able to just talk about some of the data that we've collected, kind of how we've arrived here, and Jeff went over that pretty well. I guess going back, looking at some rain data, the last substantial rain that we had was in October of 2021. That actually coincides with when La Nina actually kicked in and was declared. The last rain that we had that was above average rainfall was February, and just by a little bit. And then we lost above average rainfall in the wettest months of the year, May and June. In fact, May, June, and now July are the hottest months on record for Austin. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys that. But, right now, the Barton Springs District, we're in stage 2, meaning mandated 20% curtailment. And it looks pretty imminent that we're going to see stage 3, 30% curtailment at the end of this month or early in September. And our neighbors, the Hayes Trinity Conservation District, are already in the 30 to 40% pumpage curtailment. So obviously with all of that is why we're seeing diminished spring flows, dropping water levels, and the hydrographs that we're showing tell that story. So, Jeff and I will definitely go into a little bit more detail, and I think he did a pretty good job of going into detail. Look, that's how we've arrived here, and that's what we're dealing with. And so the outlook, without more rain, like Jeff's saying, we can expect to get down to those 2009 and 2011 levels. So different stages are met by the 2 different drought indexes that we have, which is Barton Springs flow and then Lovelady monitor well level. When those meet a certain threshold, then we go into those. The development of those drought trigger methodology was, done with a lot of historical data. To go into a little bit of detail about those thresholds, Barton Springs right now, and this is more pertaining to further out east, and we're still developing the Trinity, those thresholds. We're currently doing that now, but Barton Springs is currently flowing at about 28 CFS. That's 10 CFS below the threshold for stage 2 drought. So the board, Dan and the board, entered stage 2 back in June. And Lovelady, the water levels, 2 different, spring flow and well water levels, kind of coincide with meeting those thresholds. So if that is kind of a roundabout way of describing what we actually do to not really being able to answer why we don't just go straight to 40%. There is a level of, say, science meeting diplomacy on how to drop into those levels.
Part of the deal, if I may jump in,
Sure.
but Aaron can certainly chime in as well, is when you're managing water rights, we have permittees who are depending on water to provide to subdivisions. These are the major permittees, these are not exempt well owners, these are the big wells. And you can't just say, shut it down to 40% without a scientific backing that has to, we have the triggers, they meet the science, when it reaches this level, we have it in writing that this is what triggers the drought declaration. So we can't skip steps. It has to kind of go by trigger, by trigger, by trigger to not capriciously manage, to use a legal term. We could be taken to court for not following our own rules.
So can you tell, if people are listening to the restrictions and reducing their use? How do you tell that?
Aaron, you
Because,
want to respond to that?
So, we have monthly pumpage allotments. Every permittee does.
right,
And every month they have to submit meter readings, and we will check those to make sure that they're meeting their curtailments.
like we do here at the club,
Right.
Yes, correct.
exactly. Okay,
So every permittee has to do that.
but individual well people
We
don't know about.
we don't know about
Okay.
exempt wells,
Right.
no.
It's not a permit, so we don't.
But we put the signs out, we're asking for voluntary
Sure.
compliance and doing our best to communicate. There's a lot of really good resources on the website,
Uh-huh.
you know.
So the people, the groups of people that deliver water, the like H2O2 unit, where's that coming from the Trinity?
You mean trucked in water?
Yes.
water haulers.
You know, it's hard to know where they're getting their water. They could be getting it from a municipal water supply.
Uh-huh.
It depends on how far they're traveling.
Yeah.
It's not easy to determine.
Are they permitted?
Well, no, they're not. Where they're getting their water may be permitted or not.
But presumably, we would know about that if they were getting it from our permits, right? Because they have to report that usage to us.
They're supposed to, yes.
Y'all been talking about quantity at this point. What are the effects of the dropping of the water level on the quality of the water?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one of the things that we pay close attention to are dissolved oxygen levels in the Barton Springs flow. And so you may know that there's a couple of endangered salamanders in the pool, and the district has done really a great job in learning the relationship between rainfall and recharge and flow at the springs, its impact on the Lovelady well are two monitoring points. And so we pay close attention, along with the City of Austin, the USGS, to DO levels, because the salamanders obviously are sensitive to that. We're not seeing any other. We also monitor for volatile organic compounds, I think once a year. The Magellan Pipeline Company supports annual monitoring to make sure that there's nothing related to petrochemicals in the groundwater, at least where we're drawing those samples from. And the most recent report for that shows the water's clean, no contamination from that potential source.
Well, could you actually speak to the dissolved solids going up or down in relation to the rainfall that's out there?
TDS levels in the shallow, like Upper Trinity. I mean, we do monitor TDS levels in all the aquifers we're monitoring. And Jeff, if you want to comment more about that.
And by the way, I've really appreciated getting that information.
Sure.
During the EP horrors, I will say that, because if you have a well and someone wants to come in and all of a sudden make the well, obsolete, I mean, that's a concern out here, just like the drought is. But if you got a hole in the ground and it's no longer worth anything to you, it's not the end of the world. But the water quality coming out of it, just because you have water doesn't mean it's worth using.
That's right. And one of the unreasonable impacts that the district always looks at when we evaluate any application has to do with water quality. So we're sensitive to any potential impacts of any new application on water quality.
I'll just say at this point, so you're in the upper Trinity aquifer, and we do see variations in TDS. So when it rains, TDS tends to drop because the rainwater is much fresher and less saline than the groundwater, and it tends to go back up. At this point, we don't have any evidence that that similar pattern is happening in the deeper aquifers, which have a lot more wells in them. So that Lower Glen Rose, Cow Creek, Lower Trinity, those really don't tend to vary very much in response to rainfall events. So at this point, we don't have evidence in those lower units for a lot of change in groundwater chemistry.
Yeah, we recommend, or at least I recommend, if you're a private well owner, you should be testing your water quality annually, without question. Some people's have a monitoring well on their property, and so they benefit from the network and routine of monitoring well samples that we collect and analyze. But if you have a private well, have it sampled and tested once a year. And we have a program, actually.
Do that once a year? I mean, 'cause
We have offered, yes, we have offered a program, and the first X amount of people who take advantage of it will get their well water sampled for free. I don't know how sustainable that is, so get it while you can.
What time of year that happens?
So this year, obviously with the pandemic, things changed and we weren't doing much of that. But this year we did it earlier in the year. I know in the past, historically, we've done like neighborhood checks, where we've gone out to certain neighborhoods and done well checks. We're talking about doing something like that later this year. So I will keep all of you updated. As I asked earlier, if you sign in and you put your email on the sign-in sheet, I can sign you up for any of our updates and newsletters. We've also included like a well owner's kind of manual in your packet, along with some other information for well owners. So all of the information in terms of getting a hold of the district, there's a pamphlet in there that has like a website with our drought information that you can go to. There's well owner resources, a website page for that as well that's in your packet. So all of that information we will get out to you. Especially if we're going to be doing checks, we send out alerts through our newsletter, on our social media channels, and I'll just talk about that now while we're talking about ways to follow us. If you don't have social media, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can check our website, but we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We just got a Nextdoor channel, so I wanted to push that out. Find us on Nextdoor. We are putting information out on that. We have a YouTube channel if you like to watch videos and want to see the different things that we're doing in the district, different initiatives. But for you, signing up for alerts through our newsletter is probably the easiest way if you don't follow us on social. And you can always check our website. On the homepage of our website, there's a spotlight tab. And underneath there, any alerts that we have or pertinent information for you would be under that. We'll also put things on the header on the top of the page. So hopefully you'll find some of the information in your packet useful, because we have a lot of different website addresses you can go to.
We don't have a protocol for tracking private wells. And so that's why we urge everybody to register your well with us. So if you do have a problem, you can let us know, and at least we can know about that. And we'll know about the details of your well. How deep is it? Where's your pump set? And so forth. And so that information can be really useful. But when we have exempt wells, private wells, they're not regulated. And of course, this is newer territory for the district too. We just annexed it, so we inherited a lot of wells. We know where many are, but we won't pretend to know where they all are. And so you can't manage what you don't measure. And so I don't know how many of you have a meter on your well, but our permittees are all metered, as Aaron mentioned, and they report to us regularly. And so it's a very strict regime of keeping track of what they're using. There was a question in the back here, sir.
Yeah, I had a question about the testing. Is it relevant when water services test your well? Meaning, like, say you're going to get a softener installed or some other device installed, and sometimes they'll test it for iron levels and fluoride levels and stuff. Is that a relevant test that kind of does all parameters, or do you have to do a certain specific test?
Yeah, there's no set test per se. It's like when you go in for blood work, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of different things they could be looking for, and so you need to indicate what you're after, and of course the price will vary accordingly. Somebody who's trying to sell you a water softener, certainly they're going to really focus on anything that might contribute to total dissolved solids or metals like iron, but certainly you can have your water tested for other types of analytes. And we do have a web page that indicates some of the places you can send your water sample to.
Some of us have pretty shallow wells. I envy that 912 deep well over there, but some of us really have, ours is 420 feet. That's pretty shallow. I assume we should be testing regularly?
Well, I mean, once a year at least, and if you're more comfortable doing it more often, that's your call, but at least annually.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's probably an upper Trinity well, I would imagine,
Yeah, I
in
was
this
gonna
area.
say, if you're in if you do have a shallow well, you're also more likely to be impacted by bacteria, because it's usually more closely connected with the surface water system. So you get a big storm and that flushes a bunch of bacteria, and
it really doesn't matter if we're close to a cow-calf operation area. That doesn't matter.
It may matter.
It
I
may
mean,
matter.
if you've got a shallow well and there's that water's getting into the aquifer and you're in that shallow aquifer.
Yeah.
So that's why certainly I would say bacteria, E. coli, you want to get tested for that if you've got a shallow well. I'd be less concerned about it if you're in one of the deeper aquifers, but you can still have bacteria that you're picking up just in your surface piping, so it's always a good idea to get bacteria done, I think.
So if I use that well only for gardening, that doesn't affect the food that comes out of it.
I wouldn't expect it to. Yeah.
I always recommend, regardless of your water source, to have a Pure or a Brita or a Life Straw pitcher. It's sort of like your last line of defense. You know, I live in the city of Austin, and we have a couple of Pure pitchers going all the time. But I don't think it matters where you get your water. I just think it's a wise thing to protect yourself.
I had a question.
Yes.
We're going to back up a little bit. When you were talking about wells, known wells and unknown wells, my understanding is every time a driller drills a well, he has to register that well. So somewhere there should be a registration of all the wells that have been punched. One of my concerns is about abandoned wells. So we talked about dry wells. Wells do get abandoned. By law, they're supposed to be capped in a certain method, concrete, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure what the method is, but, and that's not happening, and that could definitely be a contributing factor to contamination for the aquifer. So just, I mean, my whole point is that if the district had the resources, I think there is a list of there is a way to find out where the wells are.
Yeah, Rayron, you want to address that?
There is a list, but it wasn't until 2003 that drillers had to start doing that. So older wells, it's a little more tricky to figure out where they're at. So
There's a level
Do they
of
register with you, or do they register with a separate state?
if they're, yeah, they have to register with the state, and if they're drilled within our district, even if they're domestic, they have to come apply for a permit with
Got
us.
everything since '03.
Yes.
And the drillers are on the hook now, since 2003, to submit a driller's report that's in addition to what we're providing too. So those two things combined are all hosted by the Texas Water Development Board. And they've, on their site, the water information data, all of these are available to look up. But for the wells before 2003, there's a little bit of sleuthing that you have to do through the TCEQ, and sometimes we can get lucky and find those. Other times they're just lost in a paper trail.
So I'd like to say a couple things because you said a couple of magic words. One, you referred to the resources of the district, and thank you for doing that. When we had our district double in size in 2015, we didn't get a double in resources to manage it, and so we derive the funds to pay staff and do what we do from fees that we charge associated with the pumping of groundwater. We are somewhat resource challenged, and you know, we're doing our best, you know, with what we have, but we could certainly use more resources. The other topic I'll touch on, and Erin can chime in as she thinks appropriate, we do have an abandoned well program, and we are active in trying to address the issue. In fact, one of the new tasks that we expect to perform in the upcoming fiscal year, our fiscal year starts September 1, is a vulnerability analysis to try to wrap our arms around the abandoned wells that are out there and then kind of prioritize, you know, if we have the funds, which well would we do next, or, you know, which landowner would we reach out to next, because there is an obligation on the part of the landowner, as you referred to, sir, you know, to help foot that bill. But another example of something that's easy to say and more challenged to make happen. But we take abandoned wells very seriously. As a matter of fact, you've probably heard that electropurification terminated their corporate existence, and we are now working with the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation to reach out to the landowners of those wells, because there are a few wells that we would like to inspect and make sure that they are in proper condition versus being abandoned. And so we're on that, and we're doing what we can to hopefully communicate with cooperative landowners, and we'll go from there.
If I see a new neighborhood come in, is that LCRA water? Are they drilling? And how is that? I'm just worried about them impacting me.
Yeah, so a new neighborhood, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Like Sky Ridge.
yeah, I don't really know where Sky Ridge is getting their water, but they have to be served by somebody.
Yeah.
Usually you don't put in a big neighborhood, with newer homes on smaller lots without a water service provider lined up.
I was just gonna say, so the county is the main regulatory agency that deals with new developments like that, and they do have requirements for water supply. So if it's not gonna be centrally served, then there's limitations on how many lots and the size of the lots, if they're gonna be drilling individual wells on each lot.
I'm more worried that they use it for the landscaping, stuff like that. I think Reunion Ranch may do that. I'm not positive. Anyway, just a question.
Yeah, outdoor water use is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. Terry?
All these abandoned wells are pretty insignificant compared to the city of Blanco.
In what respect, sir?
Blanco's dumping all their sewage in the Blanco River, and it disappears directly into the aquifer at the Burnett Ranch.
Well, we definitely have a challenge on our hands with what to do with wastewater after it's been treated. And so you all know the exceptional growth that the region is experiencing, and oftentimes you'll just hear about concern for the new demands on water supply, and there doesn't seem to be equal concerns about, well, what do we do with that sewage after we treat it? And so we do need to be as focused as possible on reusing that resource and protecting our streams and rivers. So it's just one of many challenges, for sure.
Question over here.
Yes?
So, since you said we're approaching 2011 drought level, is there I don't know, you say you don't really know private wells, so I don't know if you have an answer, but do we have any idea if a lot of wells went dry back in 2011? Like, what?
Out here, no. 2011, we just didn't have a whole, we hadn't analyzed this area yet.
Well,
So
I'm sorry, we can't hear that answer.
her question was, back in 2011, are we aware of any wells that had gone dry in that drought? The answer is out here, no. We just, outside of just hearing rumor, we weren't privy to that kind of data or that information.
So when we're reviewing permits, we basically permit on what we call non-speculative demand. So anybody applying for a permit has to provide details on what the water is going to be used for, estimates, and we basically check. We have sources that help us determine if that's correct or not, the volume that we're going to issue. We also look at things like, are there any critical environmental features around that we should be worried about? Septic features, all of that, like the well construction, things like that, to ensure that the well is going to be completed in a way that it's safe and it protects the aquifer. If it's a larger permit, we also do like the aquifer test. They have to work with our aquifer science team to ensure that no impacts happen in surrounding wells, things like that. I think that's the main things that we look at as far as permit review.
Okay. So can we talk about the different levels of permittees?
Okay, we do have 3 tiers of permittees. We have tier 3, which are our larger scale permittees. I think that's over 120 million. Those are our larger public water supply wells typically. We have tier 2 and tier 3, or tier 2 and tier 1, which are usually our smaller commercial use wells, businesses, dog kennels, things like that. And it's usually our larger tiers that require like the aquifer testing during the permit review process.